Paris, 1789. The air was thick with hunger, desperation, and whispers of rebellion. France was drowning under the weight of its debts, the burden of famine, and the extravagance of its monarchy. Ordinary people had reached a breaking point. For years, King Louis XVI and Queen Marie Antoinette lived lavishly at Versailles while peasants starved. The sight of gilded halls, flowing wine, and endless banquets contrasted cruelly with empty bread baskets in the streets. Resentment became fire, and that fire spread fast. The storm truly broke on July 14, 1789, when revolutionaries stormed the Bastille. The crumbling prison held few prisoners, yet symbolized royal tyranny. Its fall became a signal to the world. France would no longer bow quietly to kings and nobles. As mobs cheered and the Bastille's gates fell, the streets of Paris became both theater and battlefield. The revolution had been born, but no one yet imagined the shadow it would cast. Blood had been spilled, and more was to come. The National Assembly rose, declaring a new era of liberty, equality, and fraternity. Pamphlets flooded the streets. Voices shouted in the clubs and cafes, and ideas once whispered now roared. The monarchy trembled, but the people's hunger for change only grew sharper. In the countryside, peasants set fire to noble estates. Manor houses crumbled in smoke as ancient records of feudal dues were burned. The Great Fear swept across rural France, a tide of rage against centuries of exploitation. King Louis tried to play the reformer, agreeing to some changes, but to many it was too little, too late. Every royal hesitation looked like betrayal. The people demanded more, and they demanded it faster. By October, thousands of women marched from Paris to Versailles. They were hungry, armed with kitchen knives and muskets, demanding bread and justice. Their cries thundered through the palace walls. The king and queen were forced to leave Versailles and return to Paris as prisoners of their own people. The revolution was no longer just an idea. It was a living force, marching with the crowd. The monarchy, once untouchable, now sat under the watchful eyes of the city's restless masses. But where liberty was promised, suspicion also grew. Enemies of the revolution lurked everywhere, or so it was believed. Aristocrats, priests, and counter-revolutionaries were painted as conspirators. Fear sharpened into paranoia, and soon the revolution's leaders began to see threats even among themselves. The new government sought to give France a constitution, but the king dragged his feet, resisting the limits placed upon him. His secret letters and half-hearted support convinced many he could not be trusted. In June 1791, Louis XVI made a desperate gamble. He tried to flee. Disguised, he and his family slipped into the night, heading for the border. But they were recognized at Varennes and dragged back to Paris in humiliation. The king's escape attempt shattered whatever faith remained in monarchy. To the people, Louis was no longer a hesitant reformer, but a traitor plotting against the revolution. His crown now rested on the edge of a blade. As France faced invasion from monarchies abroad, cries for the king's death grew louder. Austria and Prussia threatened war to protect royal blood, and revolutionaries feared betrayal from within. The guillotine, still new, sharpened its edge for greater use. In September 1792, the monarchy was abolished, and France was declared a republic. The king was no longer His Majesty, but citizen Louis Capet. His trial became not just a question of guilt, but a test of the revolution itself. In January 1793, the verdict came. Louis XVI was condemned to death by a narrow vote. Some wept, others cheered, but all understood there was no turning back. The revolution had crossed a threshold of no return. On the morning of January 21, 1793, the king was taken to the guillotine in the Place de la Révolution. He mounted the scaffold calmly, trying to speak to the crowd, but drums drowned out his words. Moments later, the blade fell. The crowd erupted in cheers and silence all at once. Some dipped their handkerchiefs in his blood as a grim souvenir. The execution of Louis XVI shocked Europe and sealed France's fate. The revolution would not rest until all enemies, real or imagined, were purged. For Marie Antoinette, the queen once mocked as Madame Deficit, the fall was only beginning. Her trial and death loomed in the distance. The people who had once envied her jewels now demanded her head. But the revolution's thirst for justice would not stop with royals. It would stretch to priests, nobles, peasants, and even the very revolutionaries who once cried for freedom. Liberty had awakened, but it walked hand in hand with death. The first blood had been spilled on the scaffold of the king. Soon the guillotine would become not a rare spectacle, but a daily rhythm in the squares of Paris. Terror had not yet been named, but its shadow already stretched long across France. The execution of Louis XVI had sent shockwaves through France and across Europe. For some, it was a triumph of liberty. For others, it was the beginning of a nightmare. The monarchy was gone, but the revolution's appetite for blood was far from satisfied. At the heart of public anger now stood Marie Antoinette. Once adorned with diamonds and silks, she had become the symbol of excess, greed, and betrayal. The queen who once danced in gilded halls was now a widow trapped in a dank cell of the Conciergerie prison. Her trial began in October 1793, but in truth her verdict had been written long before. The court charged her not only with treason, but with moral corruption, even accusing her of corrupting her own son. The accusations dripped with venom designed to erase sympathy. She appeared in court frail, pale, and weary. Her once styled hair was now cut short, her face lined by stress and captivity. Yet when asked for her defense, she raised her voice with dignity, denying the grotesque lies with words that silenced even her accusers. The revolution had little room for dignity. The jury found her guilty, and the sentence was death. At dawn on October 16, 1793, the Queen, dressed in a plain white gown, was led to the guillotine. Unlike her husband, she had no carriage, only a rough wooden cart through the streets. Crowds jeered as the cart passed, though some watched in silence, uneasy with what they saw. This was no longer the Queen of Versailles, but a condemned woman who carried herself with unexpected calm. She stood at the scaffold and spoke only a final apology for stepping on her executioner's foot. The blade fell, and Marie Antoinette was gone. Her head was lifted to the cheering crowd, proof that the revolution had claimed another symbol of monarchy. But with her death, a darker hunger was unleashed. If the king and queen could fall, who was safe? The revolution had enemies everywhere, or so it believed. Counter-revolutionary plots, real and imagined, were said to poison France at every turn. Priests who refused to swear loyalty to the Republic were branded traitors. Nobles who stayed silent were seen as conspirators. Across the countryside, civil war erupted. The Vendée region rose in rebellion, furious over religious persecution and conscription. The revolutionary government answered with brutal repression. Villages burned, fields destroyed, rebels executed in droves. Liberty marched forward, but its boots were soaked in blood. Paris itself became a stage of suspicion. The revolutionary clubs, once united, split into factions. The Girondins and the Jacobins fought over the future of France, accusing one another of betrayal. Political rivals became enemies, and enemies became victims. The guillotine, once reserved for royals, became a daily machine of justice. Nobles, priests, merchants, and ordinary citizens filled the prisons. Lists of suspects grew longer each day, and trials grew shorter. To hesitate in condemning was to risk suspicion yourself. Maximilien Robespierre, the Incorruptible, rose higher in power. To him, virtue and terror were inseparable. He believed France could only be purified through harsh justice, that mercy itself would invite corruption. His words inspired some, but terrified many more. The Committee of Public Safety, led by Robespierre and his allies, became the engine of the revolution's harshest measures. With near dictatorial power, it oversaw war, law, and punishment. France was to be saved, but at a terrible price. Every execution was both warning and performance. Drums beat as carts of the condemned rolled through Paris. Crowds gathered to watch the blade fall, cheering, jeering, or staring in silent dread. The guillotine was no longer shocking, it was routine. Children played at beheadings with dolls, imitating what they saw in the square. Vendors sold pamphlets describing the deaths of traitors. The revolution was not only fought on battlefields, but in the minds of the people, where fear became habit. The streets of Paris smelled of iron and death. Prisoners lived in constant terror, never knowing when their names might be called. A single accusation, a careless word, or a forgotten salute to the Republic could mean a swift trial and swifter end. Some hoped the blood would satisfy the revolution's hunger, that the deaths of king, queen, and nobles would be enough. But instead, the blade demanded more. The revolution was not content with the fall of monarchy. It demanded the fall of all enemies, even among its own ranks. The Girondins, once powerful voices of moderation, were soon targeted. They were accused of betrayal, of secretly aiding royalists and foreign enemies. Arrests followed, and many were led to the guillotine. Former heroes of liberty were now branded as traitors. As heads rolled, Robespierre's voice grew louder. He painted the executions as necessary sacrifices, the cleansing fire that would forge a pure republic. But each death only deepened the shadows gathering around France. The dream of freedom had begun with cheers and hope. But now liberty was guarded by fear, and equality measured by who could survive another day without accusation. The revolution had devoured a king and queen, but its appetite had only sharpened. The blade gleamed in the sun, sharp and ready. France was no longer just a nation in revolution. It was a nation ruled by death. Terror had not been named yet, but its presence was everywhere, watching, waiting, hungering. By 1793, the guillotine had become the heartbeat of the revolution. Its blade gleamed in the Paris sun like a promise and a threat. To some, it was the instrument of justice. To others, it was the shadow of death that could fall at any moment. The Place de la Révolution, where the scaffold stood, became a theater of blood. Crowds gathered daily to watch the condemned arrive in carts, their hands bound, faces pale, eyes wide. Some cursed, some prayed, and some held their heads high with defiance. Children sat on their fathers' shoulders, watching the blade fall as if it were a game. Vendors sold pastries and pamphlets describing the day's executions. The guillotine was no longer an exceptional punishment. It was an ordinary ritual, woven into daily life. In the prisons of Paris, fear was a constant companion. Nobles, priests, peasants, and even revolutionaries shared cramped cells, waiting for their turn. The smell of sweat, rot, and despair filled the air as names were read one by one for the tribunal. The Revolutionary Tribunal was swift and merciless. Trials that once lasted days were cut down to hours, sometimes minutes. The accused were rarely acquitted. To be named a traitor was to be condemned. The law moved fast, and the blade moved faster. The Girondins were among the first major victims of this new justice. Once powerful in the revolution, they were accused of weakness, treachery, and counter-revolutionary plots. Their fall was a warning to all. No faction, no leader, no voice was safe. As carts carried Girondin leaders through the streets, the people watched silently. These were not kings or queens, but men who had once cried for liberty. Their deaths marked a turning point. The revolution was beginning to consume its own children. Maximilien Robespierre stood at the center of this storm. With his sharp features, piercing eyes, and calm, deliberate voice, he was both admired and feared. To him, the guillotine was not cruelty. It was virtue enforced by steel. Robespierre believed that without terror, liberty would die. He declared that France must purge itself of corruption, that only through sacrifice could the Republic survive. His words burned with conviction, and those who questioned him risked their lives. The Committee of Public Safety grew stronger under his hand. It controlled armies, laws, and executions. France was at war with foreign monarchies, and inside its borders, it was at war with itself. The guillotine became the answer to every threat. Ordinary citizens whispered in fear. A careless remark at a cafe, a complaint about bread, even a sigh at the wrong moment could lead to accusation. Neighbors denounced neighbors, friends betrayed friends, all to save themselves from suspicion. The guillotine's song echoed across Paris, but its reach extended far beyond. In Lyon, rebels who opposed the revolution were executed in mass shootings and drownings. In Nantes, priests and royalists were tied together and thrown into rivers in what became known as the Republican weddings. The revolution's promise of fraternity had become a cycle of blood. Mercy was branded as weakness, and hesitation was seen as treason. Those who survived each day did so by silence, obedience, and fear. The people had once dreamed of equality, yet now they measured freedom by survival. The guillotine no longer only struck down the highborn, it claimed bakers, farmers, seamstresses, and soldiers. No one's head was too humble to escape the blade. The terror was not only political, it was personal. Families wept outside the prisons, hoping for word of their loved ones. Children were left orphans, their parents condemned for crimes they did not commit. The revolution demanded sacrifices, and it demanded them endlessly. Each execution was meant to purify the Republic, but each one deepened the wound of fear. Paris was filled with a silence broken only by the rumble of carts, the roll of drums, and the sharp crack of the guillotine's blade. Robespierre stood before the people, promising that virtue would triumph, that justice required terror. He spoke of a new society, free of tyranny and corruption, but behind his words lay the ever-present blade, sharp and ready. France had cast aside its king and queen, but it had not found peace. Instead, it had found a new master, the guillotine. In its shadow, liberty trembled, equality was questioned, and fraternity became a bond forged by fear. The revolution had promised a dawn of freedom, but as the blade fell day after day, the sky over France darkened with the storm of terror. The guillotine was no longer just a tool of justice, it was the law itself. By 1793, Paris no longer dreamed of liberty in poetry and speeches. It lived under the shadow of the blade. The guillotine stood in the heart of the city like a silent monarch, ruling with steel and fear. Every morning the people woke to its presence. The prisons overflowed with the accused. Overcrowded cells held nobles beside peasants, priests beside merchants, revolutionaries beside common thieves. In the eyes of the tribunal, all were equal in one sense. Each might face the blade. Trials had grown shorter still. A defense was a formality, an echo drowned out by the roar of accusation. Those declared enemies of the revolution often found their journey from prison to scaffold measured in hours, not days. The crowds never tired of the spectacle. Vendors thrived near the Place de la Révolution, selling fruit, wine, and pamphlets, recounting the charges of the condemned. Mothers brought their children, teaching them to chant against traitors as if it were a lesson in patriotism. Every execution was theater. Drums rolled, heads were held high, and cheers rose when the blade fell. But the mood was not always jubilant. Sometimes silence filled the air, the silence of dread, the silence of people wondering if tomorrow the cart might carry them. The death of Marie Antoinette had not ended the fury, it had ignited it. Other nobles soon followed, their wealth and status offering no protection. The revolution had torn down its monarchs, and now it turned inward to devour its factions. The Girondins, accused of being too moderate, were among the first to feel the guillotine's bite. Once hailed as defenders of liberty, they were dragged through the streets as traitors. Their heads fell in rows, their death signaling that no voice of dissent would be tolerated. But the bloodletting was not confined to politicians. Priests who refused the oath to the Republic, villagers accused of harboring rebels, even women who grumbled too loudly about food shortages, any could be marked for death. Suspicion itself was a death sentence. The Committee of Public Safety ruled with an iron grip. Its members spoke of saving the Republic, but their salvation came through fear. France was at war with Europe, war with rebels, and war with shadows that seemed to hide in every alley. Maximilien Robespierre, with his calm face and piercing eyes, stood at the center. To him, terror was not a crime but a necessity. He declared that terror is only prompt, severe, inflexible justice. It is therefore an emanation of virtue. Virtue, in his hands, was sharpened steel. He saw himself as the guardian of the revolution, incorruptible and pure, but his purity demanded blood. To doubt him was to doubt the Republic, and those who doubted paid with their lives. The guillotine became so familiar that its victims were numbered like cattle. Executioners worked tirelessly, their arms strong from endless days of lifting heads and pulling levers. Death was efficient, organized, and relentless. In Lyon, rebels who resisted were slaughtered in mass executions. Cannons were fired into lines of prisoners, tearing them apart in clouds of smoke and screams. In Nantes, thousands were drowned in the Loire River, men and women tied together, thrown to the current in what became known as drownings. The revolution, which once cried for brotherhood, now silenced its enemies in rivers of blood. The word justice had been replaced by fear, and the people learned to lower their eyes, to whisper only in secret, to pray not to be noticed. Every day the carts rumbled through the streets. Neighbors watched silently as familiar faces rode past. Shopkeepers, teachers, soldiers, sometimes even friends. To speak for them was dangerous. To remain silent was survival. Some among the crowd felt uneasy, their hearts heavy with doubt. Yet they clapped and shouted, for silence itself could be mistaken for sympathy with traitors. Terror forced the people not only into obedience, but into performance. Even revolutionaries were not safe. Those who had once been comrades began to turn on one another. Leaders who disagreed with Robespierre found themselves denounced, arrested, and executed. The revolution devoured its champions as greedily as it devoured its enemies. The prisons became death's waiting rooms. Men carved last prayers into the walls. Women whispered lullabies to children who would never leave. Hope flickered like a dying candle. For most, there was no escape, only the blade. And yet, in this theater of death, the guillotine became strangely ordinary. It no longer shocked, it simply was. It loomed like a clock tower, its blade marking the hours of the Republic with every fall. The revolution had birthed a festival, but its celebration was blood. By the winter of 1793, France was soaked in fear. The revolution had not only toppled the monarchy, but also dismantled its own moderates. The guillotine stood taller than ever, its shadow stretching over every alley, every market, every home. The Committee of Public Safety, once a council of protection, had become the true government of France. It dictated war, law, and punishment. Its decrees were swift, and its power was unquestioned. Within it, one man's voice carried the sharpest weight: Maximilien Robespierre. Robespierre was not a soldier nor a nobleman. He was a lawyer, a man of words, a man of principles. But in the revolution's chaos, principles could be sharper than swords. His belief in incorruptible virtue turned into a creed, and that creed demanded sacrifice. He was not the loudest or the most charismatic, but his calm certainty gave him an aura of inevitability. When Robespierre spoke in the convention, silence fell. To disagree with him was dangerous. To oppose him outright was fatal. He painted himself as the guardian of liberty, yet his liberty came hand in hand with terror. Without virtue, terror is disastrous. Without terror, virtue is powerless, he declared. To his followers, it was truth. To his enemies, it was a death sentence. The committee's grip tightened. Laws grew harsher. The law of suspects allowed nearly anyone to be arrested on the faintest whisper of disloyalty. A careless remark, a look of hesitation, even failing to show enough enthusiasm for the Republic, could mean prison. And prison was only a doorway to the scaffold. The revolutionary tribunal became a factory of death, churning out verdicts faster than ever. Juries no longer asked if a person was guilty, but why they had not already been condemned. The guillotine worked tirelessly. Whole carts of men and women rolled daily through the streets to the Place de la Révolution. Heads fell, and the executioner's blade gleamed crimson under the sun. Paris became a city where the rhythm of life was measured by executions. For Robespierre, each death was not cruelty but necessity. He spoke of cleansing France, of purifying it of corruption and betrayal. He cast the revolution not as politics, but as a moral war, one that required endless vigilance. His words became weapons. He denounced nobles, priests, and moderates. Then he denounced radicals who strayed too far. Even allies were not safe. Georges Danton, once his comrade, now accused of corruption, was dragged to the guillotine with his followers. Danton walked to the scaffold defiantly, shouting, "Show my head to the people, it's worth seeing." His courage impressed the crowd, but his death showed the truth. No revolutionary was safe. Robespierre's justice spared no one. Another victim was Camille Desmoulins, the fiery journalist who had once rallied the people to storm the Bastille. He pleaded for mercy, begged for an end to the bloodshed, and called for clemency. But mercy had no place in Robespierre's France. His head, too, fell to the blade. The revolution was eating its own children. Yesterday's heroes became today's traitors. Those who shouted "Vive la République" in the streets one day could be silenced by steel the next. The guillotine was impartial, but it was also insatiable. Ordinary citizens lived in dread. They lowered their eyes in the markets, whispered in their homes, and forced smiles in public displays of loyalty. To weep for a condemned neighbor was dangerous. To remain silent during an execution was suspicious. The terror demanded not only obedience but performance. Applause for the guillotine, cheers for the tribunals, denunciations of traitors, all became acts of survival. The revolution did not only rule by fear, it ruled by forcing its people to join in the spectacle. In the countryside, the repression was even harsher. Rebellions in the Vendée were crushed with merciless brutality. Villages were torched, fields burned, entire populations massacred. The revolution spoke of liberty, but it carried fire and blood into the homes of its own people. Yet Robespierre stood unmoved. He believed France was at war on all fronts, against kings abroad, traitors within, and corruption in every shadow. To him, the bloodshed was not horror, but duty. He saw himself not as a tyrant, but as a savior. The Festival of the Supreme Being in 1794 revealed his strange conviction. Robespierre introduced a new civic religion, honoring reason and virtue. He appeared before the people in flowing garments, his face shining with conviction, as if he were more prophet than politician. But whispers grew among his peers. To some, Robespierre no longer seemed a man of the Republic, but a man who sought to be its god. His sermons on virtue, his demands for purity, his endless executions, all made him both revered and feared. Still, his voice held France in its grip. The guillotine sang each day, and Robespierre called it justice. The revolution had set out to destroy tyranny, yet in its wake it had created a new kind of throne, one carved from terror, with Robespierre standing at its peak. The spring of 1794 carried no warmth for France. The revolution, once a beacon of hope, had hardened into a reign of fear. Guillotine carts rolled daily, their wheels soaked in mud and blood. Paris lived in silence, broken only by drums and steel. The prisons were so crowded that even noble palaces were converted into holding cells. Men and women slept on cold stone, their eyes hollow, their hearts waiting for the call of death. Some prayed, some cursed. Most simply waited. The tribunal's trials were little more than formalities. To be accused was to be condemned. Juries no longer deliberated. They nodded. The accused walked from prison to judgment to scaffold, all in the span of a single day. The law of 22 Prairial, passed in June 1794, made the tribunal even deadlier. Evidence was unnecessary, defense was meaningless, and hesitation was forbidden. The accused could only be acquitted or executed. Few were acquitted. The guillotine worked harder than ever. In Paris, dozens of heads fell each day. Entire groups of prisoners marched together, chained and silent, their fates sealed before their names were even spoken. The air reeked of blood and fear. Maximilien Robespierre presided over this storm with unyielding certainty. He declared that terror was justice, swift and merciless. To him, France was a nation at war not only with monarchies abroad, but with treachery at home. Each death was, in his eyes, an act of salvation. But whispers of doubt spread even among his allies. Georges Danton and Camille Desmoulins were gone, silenced by the blade. Now, men who had once walked beside Robespierre began to glance over their shoulders, wondering if they too would be marked. The guillotine had become a mirror of paranoia. Factions within the revolution accused one another of conspiracy. The Hebatists, who called for radical violence, were condemned. Soon after, moderates who begged for peace met the same fate. Robespierre cut down both extremes, leaving only his voice standing tall. Ordinary Parisians moved through their days like actors in a play. They clapped at executions, shouted slogans, and denounced traitors, even when they did not believe. To hesitate was to risk suspicion. To sympathize was to die. Mothers taught their children to salute the Republic before they prayed at night. Husbands and wives avoided speaking freely, for fear their words might one day be repeated in court. Fear had seeped into every home, every meal, every whispered thought. The terror was not only in Paris. In the provinces, mass executions shook entire communities. In Lyon, prisoners were shot by cannon fire. In Nantes, the Loire River filled with bodies of those drowned by order of the revolutionary commissioners. Thousands perished without trial. Robespierre remained unwavering. He believed that a pure republic must be born through blood. To him, France was a sick body, and the guillotine was the surgeon's knife, cutting away corruption. He saw death not as cruelty, but as virtue in action. His Festival of the Supreme Being in June revealed his vision. He stood before the people in flowing blue and white garments, his face serene, as if he were delivering prophecy. He declared that reason and virtue, not kings or priests, were France's new gods. But his performance unsettled many. Deputies in the convention whispered that Robespierre had crowned himself high priest of a new religion. His serene smile looked to them less like virtue and more like ambition. Was he saving France or enthroning himself? Still, the blade sang on. Each day, carts of prisoners rumbled over cobblestones. Some went weeping, others defiant, some in silence too deep for words. The executioner's hands never faltered, and the crowd's cheers mingled with dread. By July, over 16,000 official executions had scarred France, and tens of thousands more had died in prisons or massacres. Entire families vanished. The revolution had promised freedom, but its price had become unbearable. Yet Robespierre did not yield. He rose before the convention and demanded even harsher measures. He accused unnamed enemies of conspiracy, hinting that traitors sat among them. His eyes burned as he declared that the Republic must be purified of corruption, no matter the cost. The deputies listened in silence, but their hearts pounded with fear. Each wondered if his name was already written on Robespierre's secret list. Each wondered if tomorrow the cart might carry him to the guillotine. The terror had reached its peak. France trembled under the weight of suspicion, paranoia, and blood. The revolution had consumed kings, queens, nobles, priests, peasants, and its own leaders. Now it began to turn on itself, and Robespierre stood alone at the center, unbending, unyielding, untouched for the moment. By the summer of 1794, Maximilien Robespierre's shadow stretched across France. He had been called the Incorruptible, a man untouchable by wealth or temptation. Yet now, many saw him as a prophet turned tyrant, a man whose purity had curdled into arrogance. The guillotine no longer shocked the people. Heads fell so quickly that the crowd barely reacted. Where once execution squares were packed with cheers and fervor, now silence lingered. The air was heavy, not with celebration, but with exhaustion. Even those who had once worshipped Robespierre grew weary. Deputies in the National Convention whispered in private that the revolution had gone too far. They spoke in hushed tones, afraid the wrong word might carry them to the scaffold. Robespierre had few allies left. The Hébertists were gone. The Dantonists were gone. Georges Couthon and Louis Saint-Just remained close, but even their loyalty could not silence the rising tide of suspicion. Robespierre had become too powerful, too dangerous. On July 26, 1794, 8th Thermidor by the revolutionary calendar, Robespierre delivered a speech before the convention. He spoke for hours, his voice steady, his eyes fierce, declaring that enemies of the Republic surrounded him. But he refused to name them. He let his words hang like a blade in the air, accusing everyone and no one. Deputies shifted in their seats, their faces pale. They knew the meaning. Any one of them could be the traitor he had hinted at. That night, fear gave way to anger. In smoky taverns and private chambers, deputies gathered in secret. They had watched their friends fall, one by one, to the guillotine. If Robespierre lived, they would die. If Robespierre fell, they might live. The plot was whispered in desperate voices. Tomorrow they would strike. The Incorruptible must be silenced before he silenced them all. The next morning, July 27th, 9th. Thermidor, the convention assembled. Robespierre walked in with calm certainty, believing his speech had strengthened his authority. He did not see the storm brewing around him. As he rose to speak, shouts cut through the chamber. A deputy demanded that his voice be silenced. Another declared him a tyrant. The hall erupted in chaos, accusations hurled like stones. Robespierre tried to defend himself, His voice, once commanding, was drowned by cries of, "Down with the tyrant!" Deputies who once trembled at his words now shouted him down, their fear replaced by fury. Saint-Just attempted to speak, but his words were choked by jeers. The convention had turned. The tide that once carried Robespierre to power now dragged him toward ruin. A decree was passed. Robespierre and his allies were arrested. The Incorruptible, who had sent thousands to death, now stood condemned by the same machine of law he had sharpened. But Paris was not silent. That night, the Commune of Paris, his last supporters, rose in rebellion. They freed Robespierre, Couthon, and Saint-Just and called the sections of the city to arms. For a moment, it seemed the revolution might spill into civil war again. Cannons were wheeled into the streets, drums thundered, and men swore to defend their leader. Robespierre sat among them, pale and silent, as if fate had already claimed him. Yet hesitation doomed him. Hours passed, orders faltered, and the convention struck back. At dawn, forces loyal to the deputies stormed the Hôtel de Ville, where Robespierre and his allies had gathered. Shots rang out in the smoky hall. Robespierre was found with his jaw shattered, some said by a soldier's bullet, others by his own desperate hand. Blood poured from his mouth as he was dragged away. Saint-Just was taken without resistance, his youthful face calm as though he had always known the end. Couthon, paralyzed and helpless, was carried like a broken doll. Around them, their loyal supporters scattered or were slain. On July 28, 1794, 10. Thermidor, the cart rolled through Paris. But this time Robespierre was the prisoner. His once admired face was pale, his jaw bound in bloody cloth. The crowd jeered, spitting and shouting curses. The blade fell on his allies first, Saint-Just serene to the end, Couthon trembling in his chair, then Robespierre himself, the man who had been called the Incorruptible. His eyes, wide and blazing, met the sky one final time before the blade crashed down. The crowd roared, not with grief but with relief. The reign of terror had devoured its master. The executioner lifted Robespierre's head, blood still dripping, and for the first time in years, the people cheered not for justice, but for freedom from fear. Thus ended the man who believed terror was virtue. France exhaled, as though a great weight had been lifted. The revolution did not end, but the blade slowed, its appetite finally sated, for a time. The morning after Robespierre's execution, Paris awoke to a city that felt strangely different. The same streets that had echoed with the march of prisoners to the guillotine now seemed quieter, as if the city itself was holding its breath. News of his death spread like wildfire. From the wealthy districts to the poorest alleys, people whispered that the Incorruptible was gone. For the first time in years, many dared to smile. The fear that had gripped the city loosened its claws. But relief was mixed with unease. Thousands had cheered Robespierre, believed in him, followed him. Some wondered, if he had fallen, could anyone be safe? Others feared that without him, chaos would once again consume the Republic. The guillotine stood idle that morning in the Place de la Révolution. Its blade was stained from the blood of Robespierre and his allies. For years it had been the beating heart of Paris, an altar of death. Now it seemed to hang like a relic of shame. Deputies of the convention wasted no time. They declared the days of terror over. They vowed that never again would France be ruled by fear, nor by one man's vision of virtue. Their words carried triumph, but also desperation. They needed to prove to the people that the nightmare was ending. Prison doors creaked open. Those who had awaited execution were suddenly freed. Families reunited in tears, while others wept for loved ones who would never return. Paris was filled with both joy and mourning, hope and grief, side by side. The enemies of Robespierre, once trembling in his shadow, now strutted with new confidence. Men who had hidden their voices now spoke boldly in the convention. They declared themselves saviors of liberty, though many had silently abetted the terror until the moment it turned against them. The people, however, were not so quick to forget. Mothers remembered sons lost to the blade. Fathers recalled daughters paraded in carts to their deaths. Streets once filled with revolutionary songs now murmured only with memories of sorrow. The sans-culottes, once the fiery heart of the revolution, felt betrayed. They had cheered Robespierre, believing his words of equality. Now they were left leaderless, their hopes crushed under the wheels of politics. Some muttered that the revolution had been stolen. Meanwhile, in the convention, new leaders rose. Men like Talleyrand, Barras and Fouché, those who had conspired to bring down Robespierre, now shaped the future. But they were not men of incorruptible ideals. They were pragmatists, survivors, shifting with the tides of power. They distanced themselves from the radicalism of the past, the cult of reason, the worship of virtue, the endless purges. All were abandoned. In their place came a quieter, more cautious republic, one that sought stability above all. Yet stability came at a cost. The revolution's dream of liberty and equality dimmed. Bread was still scarce. War raged on at France's borders, and those who had once shouted for justice now whispered of betrayal. The guillotine, though less active, did not vanish. Some of Robespierre's closest supporters met the blade in the weeks after Thermidor, hunted down as remnants of tyranny. But the days of mass executions had ended. Blood no longer stained the cobblestones each morning. Paris tried to heal. Theaters reopened, cafes buzzed again with laughter, and dances returned to the squares. The people sought distraction from years of fear. Yet beneath the music and chatter lingered a silence, memories of those who would never join in again. For survivors, the scars of the terror were everywhere. Empty chairs at dinner tables, shops closed forever, faces gone from the streets. The revolution had promised rebirth, but it had delivered loss to almost every household. Even the language of the revolution changed. The word virtue, once thundered from the lips of Robespierre, became hollow, almost mocked. Terror, once justified as justice, became a curse. France no longer looked to saints of the Republic, but to men who could simply keep them alive. In the villages beyond Paris, news of Robespierre's death was met with mixed reactions. Some church bells rang in quiet celebration, for priests and peasants had suffered under his decrees. Others, however, feared that his fall meant the revolution itself was crumbling. The army, fighting on distant battlefields, took little notice. Soldiers cared less for politics than for bread, pay, and victory. Yet even there, whispers spread that France had rid itself of the tyrant who sent so many to die in the name of purity. The Thermidorian reaction, as it came to be known, marked not the end of the revolution, but its transformation. The days of fiery speeches and purges were gone. In their place came backroom deals, corruption, and the slow return of inequality. But in the minds of the people, one truth burned clear. Robespierre's fall had broken the spell of fear. No leader, no matter how righteous or incorruptible he claimed to be, would ever again wield such terror unchecked. Paris exhaled, though the breath carried both relief and bitterness. The blade had fallen, but its shadow remained. The revolution had survived, but its soul was forever scarred. And as night fell over the city, the guillotine stood silent against the darkening sky, no longer the symbol of liberty, but of a lesson written in blood. In the months after Robespierre's death, the revolution staggered forward, wounded but alive. The blade had fallen silent, yet its shadow remained. France was a nation haunted by the memory of the terror, unsure of what liberty truly meant. The deputies of the convention moved quickly to reshape the republic. They abandoned the strict laws of virtue and terror, dismantling the machinery of surveillance that had crushed so many. Committees once feared became powerless, their members disgraced or dead. But while the guillotine no longer dominated daily life, its echo lingered. In every marketplace, in every tavern, stories of the terror were told in hushed voices. People remembered neighbors dragged away, children orphaned, families destroyed. The revolution had promised equality, but it had left scars deeper than anyone could count. The leaders of Thermidor, the very men who had struck Robespierre down, claimed themselves liberators. Talleyrand, Barras, and others paraded as saviors of France. Yet unlike the Incorruptible, their eyes were not on virtue but on power and survival. Corruption crept back into the Republic. Where Robespierre had been feared for his moral zeal, his successors were despised for their greed. Fortunes were made in backroom deals, offices sold to the highest bidder, and bread once again grew scarce in Paris. For the people, the revolution had shifted from hope to disillusionment. The poor who had once rallied to the Jacobins found themselves betrayed, abandoned by leaders who no longer cared for their hunger or suffering. The dream of equality slipped away like smoke, yet the revolution could not be undone. The monarchy was gone forever. Louis XVII and Marie Antoinette lay in unmarked graves. Feudal privileges had been shattered. The church's iron grip had been broken. France could never return to its old chains. Still, questions burned. Had the terror been necessary? Did thousands truly have to die for liberty to be born? In the streets, some muttered that Robespierre had been right, that only fear could protect the Republic. Others spat at his name, calling him butcher, tyrant, fanatic. Beyond Paris, the wars raged on. The armies of France, forged in the fires of revolution, marched across Europe. Victories brought pride, but also exhaustion. Mothers wept for sons lost in distant fields, even as generals grew rich and powerful. Among those generals was a young man from Corsica, Napoleon Bonaparte. Quietly, he rose through the ranks, his eyes sharp, his ambition sharper. In the chaos left by the terror, men like him found opportunity. Back in Paris, the Thermidorian leaders tried to stabilize the nation. In 1795, they established a new government, the Directory. It was a rule of committees designed to prevent another Robespierre from rising. No single man would ever hold such power again. But the Directory was weak, riddled with corruption and despised by the people. It relied heavily on the army to enforce its rule, giving men like Napoleon even greater influence. The revolution, born in the streets, now leaned on soldiers to survive. The guillotine, once the centerpiece of justice, was used sparingly. Its presence, however, could not be erased. It loomed as a reminder of how swiftly ideals could turn to blood. In the collective memory of France, it became both a symbol of liberty won and innocence lost. Robespierre himself became a ghost that haunted the revolution. To some, he was remembered as a monster, the man who turned France into a slaughterhouse. To others, he remained a martyr of principle, betrayed by those who abandoned the dream of equality. His speeches, preserved in pamphlets and newspapers, were still read in secret by radicals. His face, pale and severe, appeared in caricatures mocking him as a tyrant or as a saint betrayed. His death had not ended the debate. It had only deepened it. Meanwhile, the revolution's promise dimmed further. The poor grew poorer, and the rich found ways to regain their influence. Bread riots erupted again in Paris, and once more soldiers marched to suppress the people who had once shouted, "Liberty or death." And so the revolution, which had begun with cries for freedom, limped into a new chapter, one dominated not by ideals, but by power. The terror had ended, but its lessons were written in the minds of all who survived it. The people of France carried those memories like scars. They remembered the cheers that had once filled the squares as heads rolled. They remembered the silence that followed when grief outnumbered joy. They remembered how quickly liberty had turned into fear. And as years passed, the guillotine remained in Paris, no longer hailed as the tool of justice, but as a relic of warning. It stood as a grim monument to a truth carved into history, that revolutions could devour their own children. When Napoleon finally seized power years later, he did so not with the language of virtue, but with the promise of order. The people, weary of blood and betrayal, accepted him. The revolution that had begun with liberty and equality ended with empire. Yet the shadow of Robespierre and his guillotine never vanished. His vision of a nation purified by terror remained a specter haunting France and the world, a reminder of how easily justice can twist into tyranny. And so the reign of terror ended, not with liberty triumphant, but with a lesson written in blood, that freedom won by the blade can just as easily be lost to it.